Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised this program contains images, voices and names of people who have died. With a stroke of the pen, a man's final words
I did kill 3 times.
reveal him as one of Australia's serial killers.
Yeah, he definitely had a secret life that we never saw.
Tonight, the astonishing case of Richard Dorrough, who confessed to 3 killings before taking his own life.
He's wanting to have his last say. This is his final act.
Dorrough never named his victims.
It is a cowardly way.
But tonight, in a search that takes us across Australia, we'll reveal who they are.
Solving crimes like this, it's a matter of taking every advantage you can get. And if you let advantages go, quite often people literally get away with murder.
Good evening, I'm Liz Hayes, and this is Under Investigation. August the 9th, 2014. Richard Dorrough walks into a Perth gun range and turns a pistol on himself. He's 37, soon to be married, and a father of 3. Just days later, a parcel addressed to his fiance arrives at the family home. Dorrough had posted personal items, his computer, mobile phone, and a handwritten journal. And inside that journal were the words, "I did kill 3 times." It's a confession, but one that is cruelly incomplete. Because Dorrough has taken the names of his victims to the grave. Gary, how do you view this confession? I mean, do we believe it?
I think we have to place some weight on it, given what we know has taken place.
Joining me, Gary Jubilant, former New South Wales homicide detective with more than 25 years' experience.
Someone's last message to the world, it's almost like a half confession, but it's tantalising. I killed 3 people.
I imagine there's a sense of power that he can inflict this violence and get away with it.
Dr. Sarah Yule, a forensic psychologist who has spent 20 years analysing complex and horrific offenders and their crimes and has studied this case for us.
It's not uncommon for those who become serial killers to have that compartmentalised life.
His final act is part of the story.
Former police officer, now Senator Dorinda Cox, who is leading a parliamentary inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations women.
What does a serial killer look like? I think everyone assumes that they look like a monster, but people are genuinely alarmed that it's the guy next door, the guy they met at a barbecue.
It's a clear confession, but he doesn't name the victims. He doesn't express remorse to their families even.
And Dr. Hannah McGlade, a lawyer and human rights advocate who works with the United Nations.
Yes, it is clear he did kill 3 people, but he didn't really feel that sorry about it, I don't think.
Richard Dorrough's shocking revelation came after becoming a new recruit to the Jehovah's Witnesses, along with his fiancée, Joy.
Sometimes when we see communication designed to arrive after the person has died, it can be an attempt at game playing and trying to keep the intrigue and the mystery. I think in this case, he did care about his fiancée and that it was a desire to provide some kind of limited explanation.
But if it was an explanation for his suicide, or even an attempt to wipe the sins from his soul, his final words only traumatised those left to read them. There were no names, no dates, no locations. Did he plan this?
It certainly seems that taking his life was planned, but it's difficult to determine what his actual motivation was with the information that he left behind. He used the words, "I have killed 3 times." He's not necessarily acknowledging that they're women. He's not necessarily acknowledging that they're all murder. All of those possibilities and questions come out of such a simplistic statement.
Gary, the fact that it's designed to arrive after his death, what do you make of that?
I think it's pretty cynical. I did kill 3 people, but without providing the information. I think he wouldn't have the courage to make those admissions if he was still alive. He's just sort of hung it out there, which is rather cruel, and then sending it to his fiance. Yeah, what type of person would do that?
Broome, Western Australia, January the 13th, 1997. Richard Dorrough has been in the Navy for just 2 years. His ship, HMAS Geelong, is docked at the wharf in Broome. Along with some of its crew, Dorrough has the night off and is heading into town. Also out that night is 21-year-old Sarah Lee Davey.
She was a happy girl. She excelled in school and very friendly and very loving too.
Sarah Lee is also very trusting, and Dorrough, whom she's met at a bar, is apparently full of charm. But Sarah Lee knows little about the man she's enjoying the night with, or that this 19-year-old is about to become a serial killer.
Her trust in him was that he was in the Navy and the military or the Navy are there to protect us. So Sarah Lee would have probably had the same view of that, thinking, I could trust this man, I could go with him without having any thought about there being any risk to her safety.
In the early hours of the morning, Dorrough takes Sarah Lee back to the wharf where his ship is docked. He attempts to bring a clearly inebriated Sarah Lee on board, but is stopped by the sailor on watch, who would later say in a statement,
Mr. Dorrough appeared to be very drunk.
And also stating Dorrough told him
he was going to the end of the wharf to have sex.
The sailor on watch tells us very clearly what he saw that night.
Yeah, it's clear that the purpose of bringing Sarah Lee back to the ship was to have sex with her. It's plain as that.
The sailor on watch says Dorrough, with clear scratch marks on his face, returned from the end of the wharf alone, claiming he had left when Sarah Lee had refused to have sex with him.
When he came back down that wharf, where's the girl you're with? I don't know, and he's got scratch marks on his face. I put it at the level of extremely suspicious what happened to Sarah Lee on that night and Dorrough's behaviour. You don't have to be Einstein to work out that there's something wrong.
When they saw her there going to the wharf with this Dorrough, and if she was too drunk, why did they not do the night watchman turn around and say, you better go, and put her in a taxi and send her home?
3 days later, Sarah Lee's deeply concerned mother, Irene Davey, returns from a trip and reports her daughter missing to police.
I think we were dismissed by everyone, by the police, the local police. We left it in their hands of the law and hoping they were going to find her. But that never happened.
It's patently clear, isn't it, what happened with the scratch marks, with Sarah's now absence, that he has killed her.
Coming up,
If you're walking up that wharf, there is no way that you could go anywhere else.
the evidence sails away.
If he isn't caught, then there is that awful inevitability that another offence is likely to happen.
That's next on Under Investigation.
This will be my final teardrop.
Richard Dorrough has taken his own life after leaving a written confession stating he had killed 3 times.
This will be mine after all.
But he does not say who his victims are.
Given the circumstances and bearing in mind we've got...
We know while in the Navy, he has met 21-year-old Sarah Lee Davey at a bar in Broome in Western Australia, and that she was last seen with Dorrough walking down Broome Wharf towards his ship HMAS Geelong in the early hours of January the 14th, 1997.
Wherever you are, and let us know that you're fine.
Her mother Irene has reported her missing to Broome police, but they've told her to come back in 24 hours.
I think we were dismissed by everyone, by the police, the local police.
A mother turns up.
Yeah.
A mother knows.
Most definitely. Who knows a child better than the mother? Now, it's very easy to say, but we've got to wait for 24 hours. You don't have to wait. If there's suspicious circumstances, then you might have tracked it very quickly back to where she was last seen alive.
The circumstances of Sarah Lee's disappearance would seem damning for Richard Dorrough. A sailor on watch has seen him return alone with scratches on his face.
He should have said something. I mean, it's patently clear, isn't it, what happened with the scratch marks, with Sarah's now absence, that he has killed her. And he and the Navy had a duty to basically follow through with justice for her at the end. This should have been an open and shut case, I would have thought.
Police will later hear from a fisherman claiming he heard a scream and a splash at around the time Dorrough was on the wharf with Sarah Lee. But in what appears an indifference to the fate of a young Indigenous woman, it's information police don't even seek out until well after Sarah Lee's disappearance, despite her mother's distress.
Please tell us if you've seen Sarah Lee. That's all we want to know, if she's all right.
It made me feel angry at the time. I knew someday my feelings weren't right. But how can you tell anybody, any authority, no matter what, that's wrong? We don't have the power to say this.
And I think it's particularly tragic because we know that the first 24 to 72 hours where you're probably going to get your most valuable evidence about what has happened to the missing person.
One of the most important things is that in Aboriginal families, they would have already rung around. Sarah
That's a
Lee's
good
mother
point.
would have already rung all of the people that she knows, all the people that might have been out that night, that might have had contact with her, the regular people.
So when she was rebuffed, basically, and told to come back another day, she must have been crushed.
She was absolutely devastated, and she went back every morning for a whole month. A whole month.
Do you believe that if Sarah Lee was a white girl? things might have
Absolutely.
been-
I think that if she was from an affluent suburb in the middle of Perth, the WA police would have mobilised their resources to find Sarah Lee.
Incredibly, an official search was never conducted for Sarah Lee, despite police having a precise location for where she was last seen. And painfully for her mother, her body will never be found.
If you're walking up that wharf, there is no way that you could go anywhere else. In fact, this is a significant case where there were no resources mobilised to even look for and retrieve her body.
Bearing in mind, Liz, it's not a street, it's a wharf. You can't, oh, she wandered off.
It's 9 long days before police do anything. And by the time the homicide squad is sent from Perth, Dorrough's ship has sailed.
And with it has gone not only an important suspect, but also potential witnesses and forensic evidence. The police investigation is woefully slow. It's 3 months before they interview Richard Dorrough in Darwin. And when they do, he says he's feeling sick.
The interview is inconclusive. He is a person of interest, but he is not considered a suspect.
He's entitled to not say anything. Now, as frustrating and as ridiculous as that sounds, he's well within his rights not to participate in the interview. But given the circumstances, I think there would be sufficient evidence to, at the very least, search his cabin find his belongings. What clothes was he wearing on that night? Let's seize those clothes. Perhaps we could have got DNA or something might be telling there might be blood stains there. Solving crimes like this is a matter of taking every advantage you can get. And if you let advantages go, quite often people literally get away with murder.
Instead of furthering their inquiries on Dorrough, police lose time chasing false sightings of Sarah Lee. In the end, the investigation stalls. Sarah Lee's disappearance remains unsolved and Dorrough goes free.
We can't know whether he went out that night with an intention to commit murder. We know that he had sexual intent, that's clear.
Yes.
And then things have escalated from that point, and that impulsivity and the opportunistic targeting of a victim becomes part of his pattern.
I got up, I couldn't sleep. And I walked to the edge of the mangroves on the other side. And I stood and I called out her name. I don't know what made me do that. You know, and I was just had that, like there was something drawing me, I don't know. Just, yeah, I let my anger out. I wanted to know where she was.
If the police failed Irene Davey, so too did the Navy. The sailor on watch that night admitted he had suspicions about Sarah Lee's fate, yet only told police in a statement months later. And at around the same time as Sarah Lee's disappearance, the Navy investigates Dorrough's on-board behaviour.
He required constant supervision when on duty.
Some of the crew complain he is unreliable, impulsive and untruthful.
He was a compulsive liar.
A psychological assessment says Dorrough is amoral and angry.
It's all building an alarming picture for Dr. Sarah Yule.
There is a record of impulsive behaviour and some violent tendencies as well. So if people have, you know, a tendency to impulsive violence, that won't necessarily just come out with their chosen victim type. It tends to emerge in other contexts as well, whether it be relationships or in the workplace. So they're still adding further pieces of the puzzle to what is making this person behave the way that he does.
Dorrough is discharged from the Navy and moves to Sydney. And Sarah Lee Davey is all but forgotten.
Do we all agree that Sarah Lee is a victim of Dorrough's?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you?
Yes.
Without doubt.
Well, he's now on the streets. He must be, what, emboldened?
Well, you get away with murder, and this is in my experience, if someone gets away with murder, it does give them a little bit more confidence. Oh, that was, I thought I was going to be caught. I murdered someone. This is the danger of it.
It's plainly obvious that he was involved in her death, her killing, and then he's released. And I think this is really indicative of the way that Indigenous women's lives have been so long devalued, treated violently in Australia, such that we are calling this Indigenous femicide.
Yeah, I find that devastating, but what would you expect he's thinking?
Well, from a psychological perspective, there is a difference between somebody who commits a murder and something different going on for somebody who commits a second or more murders. So in that sense, yes, he may feel that he gets away with it, but there are other issues that are feeding that need for him to offend again anyway. And so if he isn't caught, then there is that awful inevitability that another offence is likely to happen.
Coming up, another victim is hunted down.
When you look at that crime scene, does it tell you anything about the perpetrator?
It certainly does.
But where are the police?
The fact that nobody had contacted her mother and said, actually, your daughter is in the morgue, is just horrifying.
That's next on Under Investigation. The last written words of Richard Dorrough.
I did kill 3 times.
Tonight, we're investigating who his 3 victims were. An inquest in 2016 will determine 21-year-old Sarah Lee Davey died the night she was last seen in Broome in Western Australia. Not helped by a poor police investigation, the coroner makes an open finding and is unable to say how Sarah Lee died.
It made me feel angry at the time. But how can you tell anybody, any authority, no matter what, that's wrong? We don't have the power to say this.
But after examining the evidence, our experts believe she was killed by Dorrough, and that having avoided further scrutiny by police, it's reasonable to believe he's feeling emboldened.
If he isn't caught, then there is that awful inevitability that another offence is likely to happen.
King's Cross, Sydney, November the 6th, 1998. 29-year-old Rachel Campbell is about to go out, promising her little daughter she'll be back soon. But she never returns. The next morning, Rachel's naked body is found wrapped in a sheet in the car park of St Joseph's Church in Rosebery. It's a vicious murder. Rachel is stabbed, it's believed, with the pocket knife she always carried for her own protection. Police also believe she's been raped. And in what will be critical evidence for forensic psychologist Sarah Yule later in our investigation, Rachel has also been bitten.
When you look at that crime scene, does it tell you anything about the perpetrator?
It certainly does. It's what we describe as dumping. There is no evidence of victim empathy, no evidence of any remorse that may have been experienced after something that may have impulsively occurred. She's found face down as well as a very dismissive attitude demonstrated towards Rachel.
Rachel Campbell was a vulnerable single mother, and Richard Dorrough happened to live nearby.
It's really very sad. She was a Murray woman of bicultural ancestry, living in Sydney, and had an addiction, and she was doing sex work, which is common. She wants to be safe, but, you know, she met with this very dangerous person.
When Rachel didn't return home, her mother called police the next morning.
But they showed little interest and told her to call back the next day, just as police had when Irene Davey reported her daughter, Sarah Lee, missing in Broome.
Another mother.
Another mother. Pretty much the same as Sarah Lee's mother, that the mother is the first one to alert the police. Another mother who, again, is aware instinctively that something is wrong, you know, that these aren't her usual movements, but again, falling on deaf ears because the police are quite, well, you know, maybe wait a little while.
When another day passes, Rachel's sister, a former Australian Federal Police officer, calls again. What she's told is truly shocking. Rachel's body is in the morgue and has been for 2 days.
The fact that nobody had contacted Rachel's family, nobody had gone back to her mother and said, actually, your daughter is in the morgue, is just horrifying.
Do you think there's a bias in this as well?
I think there definitely is. I think that given that she is, as Hannah's already said, of Maori descent and Indigenous.
Forensic testing provides police with important evidence. DNA from Rachel's body, the sheet she was wrapped in, and from 2 condoms left at the scene.
It's fairly obvious if you find who can match the DNA with the condoms and the blanket and the other things that were found, that you're going to lead you to who was involved in her murder.
But at the time, there was no national DNA database. Police could not find a match, and the case went cold. It was fortuitous for Richard Dorrough, who was living just 3 kilometres from where Rachel's body was found.
I've found most murder investigations that if a body's been dumped, it's usually where someone's comfortable with. So he might have been familiar if he's only living 3 kilometres away. That's a church, it's an area where no one would be around, and dumping the body there.
I think police actually knock on his door. When you're door knocking, if you'd come across somebody like Dorrough.
I think I'd like to say I'd see something sinister, but I could imagine he could answer the door and speak to a police officer. What are you doing? Oh, right, no, I haven't seen anything. It'd be quite simple to dismiss the police in that regard.
Police investigations led them to believe the attacker most likely picked Rachel up in a van. And we've discovered that at the time, Dorrough owned this orange combi van. But 10 years pass. Rachel Campbell's murder becomes a cold case, unresolved with no leads. In that time, Dorrough kept on the move, first to Queensland, then to Perth, where he lived with his brother-in-law, Stuart. Speaking publicly for the first time, Stuart remembers well the phone call he received from Dorrough that should have changed everything.
It was just a normal weeknight, and I got home from work and received a phone call, and it was Richard, and he said, "I won't be home for dinner. I'm in the Perth watch house. I've been arrested for murder."
Coming up,
we were just shell-shocked at the time. We didn't know what to do.
What will it take?
There's a sense of power that he can inflict this violence and get away with it.
To stop a serial killer.
It's clear to all of us sitting here, he should have been charged and convicted.
That's next on Under Investigation. It's late 2008, and police are closing in on Richard Dorrough. A detective delves into the cold case murder of vulnerable Sydney mother Rachel Campbell, whose body was found wrapped in a sheet.
It's really very sad, a young mother. She was a Murray woman of bicultural ancestry, living in Sydney, and had an addiction, and she was doing sex work, which is common.
DNA taken from her body and the scene is entered into the newly established National DNA Database. And finally, 10 years after the attack, it comes up with a match. Richard Dorrough has irrefutably been placed at the scene of Rachel Campbell's murder. On January the 6th, 2009, Dorrough is arrested in Western Australia, where he's been living, and brought to Sydney to face trial.
And the prosecution believes it has compelling evidence.
You've got 2 condoms, you've got Rachel's body that was dumped, wrapped in a sheet, and also swabs taken from Rachel, all contained Dorrough's DNA. And on the sheet that was Rachel's body was wrapped in, the only male DNA on that sheet was Dorrough's. Now, he was there right at the time of Rachel's murder.
Dorinda, is this not a case that looks like they've got their man?
Absolutely, be saying that Dorrough, killed Rachel Campbell.
But Dorrough's defence is robust. Rachel was a sex worker, and Dorrough admits he was a client on the night, but it's argued he may not have been the only one.
We know that there is an issue regarding juries and jury bias where victims are Indigenous, perpetrators are non-Indigenous.
Human rights lawyer Hannah McGlade believes Rachel's work and her Indigenous Maori heritage may have had an impact on the jury's perception of the crime.
I think that lawyers also know there's a problem of systemic racism in the legal system, and they're going to run with it. If their client is white, they can get him off, they can position him as a nice guy. There were no Aboriginal people on this jury.
And critically, the jury has no idea Dorrough has been questioned over the disappearance of Sarah Lee Davey 13 years earlier. In April 2010, the jury finds Dorrough not guilty.
The jury system works, I suppose, in part because people bring in their knowledge, but they also bring in their biases for the good or bad. And how he was acquitted, I would have been very shocked, knowing what I know about the case, that he was acquitted of that. But bearing in mind it only takes one jury member, and someone can walk.
The judge in the case, Justice David Kirby, will later state that if it had been his decision and not the jury's, he would have convicted Dorrough.
Hannah? The presiding judge has publicly stated that he believes that there was enough evidence to convict Dorrough.
Absolutely. That's clear. It's clear to all of us sitting here. It's clear to the judge. He should have been charged and convicted. So they were in the blind, as well as having, no doubt, their own level of prejudice or lack of affinity with Rachel.
But tonight we'll hear from witnesses whose evidence could have been pivotal to the case, information the jury never heard.
I just went up to his bedroom and just had a look through.
Speaking for the first time, Dorrough's brother-in-law, Stuart. Dorrough was living with Stuart in Perth when arrested for Rachel Campbell's murder. Reeling from what he'd been told, Stuart then checked Dorrough's upstairs bedroom.
There was a couple of laptops up there, and when I woke them up, they were on porn sites.
Stuart says he's always been disturbed by what he found.
It would take you a lifetime to watch it. There was that much of it. There was all types of sex, like right down to child pornography as well. We were just shell-shocked at the time. We didn't know what to do. We weren't approached by any police. I would have thought the police would have liked to have access to all of that stuff.
You're not surprised, I presume, by that pornography?
Not by this stage, with the information that has unfolded about this man. From an investigative perspective, the deviant sexual interests are extremely important because sexual offenders are trying to meet emotional needs with the use of sexual violence as a tool. But it is certainly not surprising that other explorations of deviant sexual interests would be in somebody's possession.
And we have received further evidence of Dorrough's guilt. In 2000, he was serving a prison sentence in Queensland for a hit-and-run offence. And he voiced his concern about his DNA being taken when visited by his then partner and her friend, Karen.
And one time straight after we left the jail, his former partner said to me that Richard had said to her that he was shit scared of them taking his DNA because he had killed somebody in Sydney. And he was terrified that that DNA would then lead them to connecting him to that murder.
That would be pretty powerful evidence, though, wouldn't it, for a loved one to hear a confession?
Powerful evidence to hear it if it was presented to a court, most definitely. If a partner came in and said, this person confessed to me, that's direct evidence. It's an admission. So, yeah, it would be strong evidence.
Karen also revealed messages she received from Dorrough's then partner expressing some alarming concerns.
He threatened to kill me and said he had done it before and would do it again.
But again, it's evidence the jury would never hear when, somewhat unbelievably, it acquits Richard Dorrough of Rachel Campbell's murder 9 years later.
What's his reaction, would you expect?
I imagine there's a sense of power that he can inflict this violence and get away with it. It seems an incredible result. How could this be? I would imagine that would increase his confidence that this has been the result that he's achieved. But again, remembering that he doesn't value the victims anyway. So I think there is very little emotional engagement in those past crimes or the victims that he targeted.
Do we agree Dorrough has killed Rachel?
I do.
Yes.
Everybody?
But in the eyes of the law, Dorrough is an innocent man, and he returns to Western Australia, potentially believing he was invincible, to begin a new life. He meets Joy, They have 2 children and are engaged to be married. And apparently, he finds God, joining the Jehovah's Witnesses.
We can perhaps be a little bit cynical about how much Richard Dorrough actually wanted to join the church. There isn't much evidence at this point, I don't think, as to whether or not he was experiencing some kind of sudden empathy or a desire to do good. I don't feel we have that evidence.
He hasn't, literally found God and changed his ways. I don't buy into that. I think he's just used that just to make him feel better about himself and make people around him trust him. Oh no, that couldn't be him. He's associated with the church. I'm not buying that. There's nothing about the way that he's lived his life that tells me he's a good person.
Coming up,
I did kill 3 times.
we've found 2 victims.
There is certainly a pattern that has emerged.
Another victim with bite marks.
But who is the 3rd?
How do you get away with murdering 3 Indigenous women in this country?
That's next on Under Investigation. Tonight, we're investigating serial killer Richard Dorrough.
I did kill 3 times.
He's confessed to 3 murders, but gives no hint of his victims. But our experts agree 2 were almost certainly Sarah Lee Davey, last seen alive with Dorrough in 1997 in Broome, Western Australia. And a year later, in 1998, Rachel Campbell, believed to have been stabbed with her own pocket knife not far from where Dorrough was living in Sydney. But who was the 3rd victim? It's a chilly May night in 1996 on Oxford Street in Sydney. 30-year-old hairdresser Paula Brown is out with friends. She's a young woman of Maori heritage, an Indigenous woman, as was Sarah Lee Davey and Rachel Campbell. That night, Paula Brown, who fits Dorrough's victim profile, goes missing.
8 days later, her body was found at Port Botany. She'd been struck twice on the head and sexually assaulted.
Hannah, when you look at this particular case, can you see Dorrough's fingerprints?
I think there's a very real possibility. She's a Maori Indigenous woman. She's a pretty young woman. Certainly, I think this is a real possibility. She met her death again in this horrific manner of violence, misogyny, and I think hatred to First Nations Indigenous women.
Sarah, with hindsight, if we accept that we know of 2 victims now, is he profiling his victims?
Well, there is certainly a pattern in his choice of victim that has emerged. For an investigative benefit, we don't always need to know exactly why that is his victim choice. What's important is that that pattern is there and starting to identify, we think we have a serial offender here. It's certainly key in that.
And there are other clues. Dorrough was in the Navy, and Paula Brown's hairdressing salon was across the road from a pub where sailors regularly drank.
While detectives displayed a mannequin dressed in Paula's clothes, relatives scoured Oxford Street where she disappeared, hoping for clues.
At the time, police stated the killer was most likely a white male, quick-tempered, with a history of violence. A man, police said, who was used to getting his own way with women. All seemingly a close match to Dorrough, according to forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Yule.
He's definitely had a pathway through violent history that is what has contributed to him becoming a person who has repeatedly killed. Somebody who has certain attitudes towards the victim that he chooses and, in a crude term, their disposability and their lack of importance or significance as a human being.
There's one other compelling clue potentially linking Dorrough to Paula's murder. She was bitten by her attacker, as was Rachel Campbell. And during his murder trial, Dorrough admitted to biting his partners and sex workers.
The bite marks, I think, is... in my experience in homicide, I haven't seen many with the bite marks, so another victim with bite marks.
Bite marks, is that a signature?
It certainly is quite a rare behaviour. What is significant, there can be strong linkage established between cases. Dorrough admitted to engaging in biting behaviour.
To leave the marks, that's a force.
There's
violence
considerable
in that, is it?
force behind it. It's another violent tool. And we also know from other witness evidence that that was a part of his sexual practices, consensual or otherwise, with other partners. But also, we know that Richard Dorrough, if he's killed Sarah Lee and he's killed Rachel, he didn't bring a weapon. That's a key part of what we could call his signature as well. And so we know that he has preferred manual force. So the fact that Paula has blunt force, wounds to the head, perhaps also the chest, you know, as well as the bite mark, he's perfectly capable and willing to engage in that level of violence. There's also the dumping of the body, which is another consistency.
Are you of the belief that Dorrough is a suspect in this case?
I think, yeah, it's certainly not at the level of being conclusive at this point, but with some of those compelling consistencies and the relative rarity of those behaviours occurring in combination, you would have to look very strongly at it, for sure.
Paula Brown was killed before the murders of Sarah Lee Davey and Rachel Campbell. She would have been Dorrough's first victim. Her murder has never been solved, and the case remains open. On August the 9th, 2014, Richard Dorrough took his own life. He had eventually come to police attention in the murder of Rachel Campbell, but despite overwhelming evidence against him, he was acquitted. There are now deep concerns about how Dorrough's crimes against women of colour were investigated.
I still look for answers in justice. Nothing was done, nothing at all. But I think it's time. There should be something being done about our people being missing.
Irene Davies' daughter Sarah Lee has never been found.
26 years now. Case may be closed. But to me, I never said goodbye. I never put my baby down. If there was a grave, if there was a body, then yes. But nothing.
I really feel that the West Australia Police and the Navy owe Sarah Lee Davies' family an official apology for their failures here.
Their families have a story to tell, and they have a story to tell about their experience with the system.
In Australia, more than 350 First Nations women have either gone missing or have been murdered since the year 2000. And Senator Dorinda Cox is chairing a federal parliamentary inquiry to expose the truth behind this horrific statistic.
So this is why we are looking particularly at how systems are working, particularly amongst jurisdictions that we know in these cases have highlighted those three women that have failed and failed those women and their families, but also honouring the lives of those victims. The lives have not been valued, and this is why we see the bias and the racism that continues to perpetuate in the system.
I think what we're seeing here is a litany of failures for the three victims that we certainly know of. Dorrough was a white privileged male. How do you get away with murdering three Indigenous women in this country? We have not addressed the deep underlying racism that has been evident to Indigenous women that mainstream society still is not aware of, really.
Richard Dorrough's victims were Indigenous women. Policing failure saw him escape justice time and again. A serial killer who, despite his last-minute confession, still kept many secrets.
With new evidence we've revealed tonight, there has to be a suspicion that there are other unsolved homicides, other violent encounters involving Richard Dorrough. Sarah, do you believe Dorrough may have committed other offences?
Look, I think, yes, even if there weren't other murders potentially, with what we know of his deviant interests, I think there's a high chance that there are likely other victims of physical violence, sexual violence. So I would not be surprised at all if there were other victims through that context.
If you have been a victim or have any information about Dorrough, please contact Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000 or contact us on our confidential email underinvestigation@9.com.au. The details of Senator Dorinda Cox's parliamentary inquiry can be found on our website. And if anything in this program has raised concerns for you or someone you know, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or lifeline.org.au. I want to thank you all very much for joining me tonight, and I thank you. I'm Liz Hayes. Good night. Hello, I'm Liz Hayes, and thank you for watching Under Investigation. Subscribe to our channel now for exclusive clips, and don't miss out on full episodes of Under Investigation on 9Now and the 9Now app.